She walked into her husband's office with flowers and found his mistress sitting in her chair. Pregnant, betrayed, and humiliated, she could have broken, but instead she rose. What followed was a war of power, revenge, and a mother's unshakable will to protect her son's future. You won't believe how she turned the scandal into strength and brought an empire to its knees. Where are you watching from? Subscribe now for more powerful true stories that stay with you long after they end. I stood outside the Blake Tower, clutching a small bouquet of lilies and a box of Graham's favorite sushi, my other hand resting on the swell of my stomach. The city glittered around me like a glass kingdom, sharp and cold and too perfect. It was our 4th anniversary. I should have been home preparing for the dinner he said he was coming home early for. But instead, I had chosen to surprise him. A small gesture. Lunch, flowers, love. That's what you do when you're married and in love and 6 months pregnant with your first child. You try, you reach. The lobby doors slid open with a soft hiss. I smiled at the doorman, who looked startled to see me. I hadn't visited the office in months. Pregnancy had made me tired and soft, and besides, Graham always said the office wasn't a place for a lady about to be a mother. But today felt different. Maybe it was the way he whispered, "Tonight we celebrate," against my neck this morning, after pressing a single red rose onto my pillow. Maybe it was the way he lingered at the door before leaving, as if something unsaid hung between us. I felt it in my bones. A tightening. A shift. The elevator climbed smoothly, its interior gleaming like the inside of a jewel box. My reflection stared back at me, soft curls pulled into a neat bun, a flowing cream maternity dress that skimmed over my bump, the lilies trembling ever so slightly in my hand. I breathed in deep. "It's just a surprise," I told myself. "You'll walk in, he'll smile that smile, and everything will be perfect." I didn't know then that I was saying goodbye to perfect. The elevator opened directly into the executive suite, as it always had. His secretary, Miss Carson, glanced up with the weary grace of a woman who had spent too long guarding the gates of power. Her lips stretched into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Blake, what a lovely surprise." "I thought I'd bring him lunch," I said brightly, holding up the bento box and the flowers. "And these?" He's always said lilies remind him of his mother. Miss Carson hesitated. It was brief, barely there, but my breath caught anyway. "He's in a meeting right now," she said. "I could take those in for you." "Oh, it's just a second," I said, already moving past her. "He won't mind." "Mrs. Blake," she called after me, but her voice was swallowed by the heavy oak doors I was already pushing open. The scene hit me like a punch to the lungs. Graham's office, the site of so many tender conversations and celebratory kisses, was now a theater of betrayal. My eyes went first to the chair. My chair. The curved leather seat he had specially designed for me, where I'd sit on afternoons I visited him, back when this empire of his still felt like ours. She was sitting in it. Long, raven-black hair fell in sleek waves past her shoulders. An emerald dress clung to her like melted glass, every curve intentional. Her legs were crossed elegantly, one stiletto swinging lazily in the air. Her hand, those crimson-painted nails, rested on Graham's head. Because he was kneeling. My husband, the man who had cradled my belly just last night and whispered promises to our unborn son, was on his knees with his head in another woman's lap. His suit was wrinkled. His tie loosened. His eyes closed. The box slipped from my hands. It hit the floor with a sharp clatter, sushi scattering like little jewels across the polished marble. The lilies drooped. Silence cracked open. Graham jerked upright, his face registering the kind of horror that only comes when all your lies catch up to you at once. "Julia," he said, scrambling to his feet. My name on his lips felt wrong, heavy, false. The woman didn't move. She tilted her head, a slow, feline smile curling her lips. "Well," she said softly, her voice silk-soaked in venom. "If it isn't the lady of the house." I knew her, of course. Everyone did. Vanessa Marlowe, Chief Operating Officer. Brilliant, ruthless. Graham always said she was essential. He said it with respect. I never liked the way he said her name. I couldn't speak. I looked at her, then at him. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Graham stepped forward. "It's not what it looks like," he began, voice hoarse, stupid. "Oh, come on," Vanessa said, rolling her eyes as she stood, graceful, commanding, confident. "It's exactly what it looks like. The poor man needed comfort. You know how stressful it is running an empire." My chair, I finally whispered, my voice unfamiliar even to me. Get out of my chair. Vanessa arched an eyebrow. Your chair? She said mockingly. Darling, this is the seat of power, and right now, I'm the one sitting in it. I turned to Graham, pleading, tell her to leave. He looked like he'd been drained of all color. His eyes darted between us. Then he said, with a voice so low I barely heard, Vanessa, maybe you should go. Go? She echoed, laughing low. Oh, Graham, don't tell me you're actually going to play the noble husband now, not after everything we've... That's enough, he barked, but the damage was done. The words hung in the air, undeniable. My body reacted before my mind caught up. A pain shot through my abdomen, sharp and deep. My hand went to my stomach instinctively. The world blurred, colors and sounds melting together. I stumbled backward. Julia! Graham lunged forward. Don't touch me, I whispered. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I walked. One step, then another. Past the lilies on the floor, past the scent of betrayal in the air, past Miss Carson, who looked up with horror in her eyes, past the security guards who didn't know whether to stop me or bow. I pressed the elevator button and didn't look back. When the doors closed, I finally breathed. It was the sound of something breaking inside me. I had walked into my husband's empire to deliver him love. I left holding nothing, not even myself. But I wasn't alone. I had our child. And somehow, I knew that what came next, whatever fire, whatever war, would not destroy me. It would define me. The city roared outside the tower's glass shell, but inside the elevator, everything was silent. Just the faint hum of descent and the pulse in my ears, thudding like a war drum. I held onto the brass rail with a trembling hand, my legs weak beneath the weight of shock and the child inside me. My baby. Our baby. I could still see her, Vanessa, lounging like a queen in that chair. My chair, the one Graham had said was made just for me, because no throne should go empty when its queen visits. It had taken less than a minute to erase 4 years of love, 8 months of pregnancy, and 1,000 whispered promises. All it took was her legs crossed and his head in her lap. The elevator reached the ground floor, and I stepped out on autopilot, moving like a woman in a dream. No, a nightmare, the kind where you scream, but no sound comes out. The security guards glanced up, their usual stiff nods replaced by wide-eyed confusion. I could feel their stares trailing behind me like a stain. They didn't stop me, no one did. Outside, the wind slapped my cheeks like cold truth. Horns honked, a siren wailed somewhere far away. People bustled around me, eyes on their phones, heads down, lives intact. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't even know what direction I was walking in. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. If I stopped, I might shatter like the lilies still lying on the floor of Graham's office, crushed and meaningless. The sidewalk beneath my flats blurred as memories collided. Him whispering to my belly at night, telling Ethan about the treehouse he would build, how he would teach him to surf on the waves in Montauk, how he cried when we heard the heartbeat for the first time. I had clung to those moments like proof. Proof that I was loved, that I was enough, that we were enough. I turned a corner and almost collapsed. The nausea wasn't just from pregnancy anymore, it was betrayal curdled into bile. My feet finally stopped in front of a small, unassuming building on a quiet block in Soho. I hadn't even realized I'd been walking toward it. My body had remembered what my mind had forgotten: safety. It was the first gallery I had ever worked at. The first place I was ever seen, not as Graham Blake's wife, not as a soon-to-be mother, but as Julia, the girl who could spot genius in brushstrokes. The chipped gold placard still hung above the door. Raymond Collective. My heart slammed once against my ribs. I stepped inside and was instantly swallowed by the familiar scent of turpentine, dust, and linseed oil. It was warm, honest, a world away from marble floors and Armani suits. A woman with streaks of silver in her dark braid looked up from behind the desk. Celia Raymond, my mentor, my firebrand. She stood without a word, eyes locking onto mine. My God, she whispered. Julia. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My lips moved, my throat tightened. Then she was there, holding me, not with pity, but with anchoring strength. I sobbed against her shoulder, the lilies gone, the chair gone, the woman I thought I was, gone. When the tears slowed to hiccups, we sat on the old velvet bench under the skylight. Celia handed me a steaming mug of tea. I held it for warmth more than thirst. Start from the beginning, she said, voice low and steady, and I did. I told her about this morning, how he kissed my neck, left a rose on the pillow, told me we would celebrate tonight. I told her about the bento box, the smile I was expecting, the gleam of the doors opening, and then the scene. Her in that dress, his knees on the floor, that smug, knowing smile on Vanessa's face, that unspoken claim. I didn't even realize I was gripping the mug so hard until Celia gently pried it from my fingers. He said, "It's not what it looks like." I choked out, the words tasting like rust. And she said it was the seat of power, and she was the one sitting in it now. Celia's lips tightened. That snake. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Why now? Why her? We were happy, or I thought we were. He was decorating the nursery, talking to Ethan. He loved us." "No, sweet girl," she said gently. "He loved the idea of you, of having a beautiful wife and a baby and a life that made him look like a man with roots. But men like Graham..." Her voice turned flint hard. "Men like him build glass empires and think they're bulletproof. Then someone like her comes along and feeds their ego what you can't. Ruthlessness, ambition, fire without loyalty." I wiped my face with the back of my hand, still shaking. "What do I do now? I have nothing, Celia. I gave everything to him." "You have yourself," she said fiercely. "And you have your son. That's not nothing, that's everything." I sat very still. Her words echoed inside me like the quietest drumbeat in the world. For the first time since I left that office, I wasn't drowning. I wasn't just broken, I was angry. Graham didn't just cheat, he replaced me. In a space that was mine. In a chair that symbolized my place in his kingdom. And she sat there like she owned it, like I'd never existed. Like I was nothing more than a storybook he'd closed the minute the ending got too real. But I wasn't finished. I stood slowly, the ache in my lower back reminding me that I wasn't alone. Ethan shifted inside me, tiny, perfect, and unknowing. I laid a hand on my stomach. "I'm not going to let him grow up thinking this is what love looks like," I said quietly. "I won't let her win. I won't let Graham walk away with everything." Celia smiled, proud and sad all at once. "Then you need to call a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. You need someone who knows how to destroy glass empires without breaking a sweat." She pulled out her phone and handed it to me. The screen was already open to a contact. Mark Ellison, attorney at war. I didn't hesitate. I dialed. Because this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the reckoning. Mark Ellison answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Blake," he said, his voice low, precise, and cool as polished steel. "I've been expecting your call." The calm certainty in his voice caught me off guard. "You have?" When a man like Graham Blake, a man with a net worth higher than several small countries, commits a public indiscretion, word travels fast. The vultures circle. I prefer to be the eagle. I almost smiled. Almost. My other hand rested on my belly, feeling the smallest kick. "I'm not interested in playing games, Mr. Ellison. I want to leave him, but I want to do it on my terms." "And what are those terms?" "I want to protect my child's future," I said, feeling my voice strengthen with each word. "I want to be financially independent. And I want to make sure that Vanessa Marlowe," I nearly spat her name, "never profits from my pain." There was a beat of silence on the line, then a low, knowing chuckle. "Mrs. Blake, I believe this is the beginning of a beautiful and very profitable partnership." By the time I ended the call, my spine felt straighter, the shaking in my hands gone. Mark didn't just offer legal advice, he gave me a battle plan. His first commandment was simple but powerful. Do not engage. No calls, no texts, no emotional late-night responses. "Silence," he said, "is a weapon. Let Graham stew in it. Desperate men make foolish mistakes, and we would capitalize on every one of them." Over the next 72 hours, I disappeared. I left Celia's gallery with a kiss on the cheek and her promise that the door would always be open. With her help, I found a quiet apartment tucked away in a sleepy neighborhood in Brooklyn Heights. It had creaky floors, a view of a crooked elm tree, and none of the glittering grandeur of the penthouse, but it was mine. I changed my number, switched to a new email, and created a digital fortress around myself. Graham's calls and texts flooded my old inbox like a broken dam, but they couldn't touch me now. I watched from the shadows as the empire we'd built together, at least the illusion of it, began to falter. At first, the media hadn't noticed. Graham Blake was still the golden boy of New York's skyline. But then Vanessa made her move. A story appeared on a scandal site 2 days later. The Blake affair, The headline screamed. A glossy article with too many details to be coincidence. It didn't just confirm the relationship between Graham and his COO. It portrayed him as a tragic hero, overworked, misunderstood, and ensnared in a marriage with a woman too emotional, too possessive, too fragile. That woman, of course, was me. I sat at my tiny kitchen table in my new apartment, reading the article on my laptop, a knot tightening in my stomach. The writer had painted me as a manipulative wife who had trapped a billionaire with a baby and was now using it to bleed him dry. It was so perfectly venomous, so subtle in its cruelty, I almost admired it. "She's changing the narrative," I told Mark when I called him, my voice cold. "She wants the world to see him as the victim. She's setting the stage." "And she's done it too fast," Mark replied, already 10 steps ahead. That article wasn't just damaging, it was stupid. It gave us what we needed. I furrowed my brow. "What do you mean?" "She wants to play this game in the media? Fine, but we're not going to respond with gossip. We're going to respond with facts, with something so devastatingly truthful that she'll regret ever opening her mouth." And that's when he said it. "We've been looking into Vanessa Marlowe's past, and we found something." I sat up straighter, my hand instinctively shielding my stomach. "She has a daughter." The silence on the line was deafening. "She what?" "She gave her up for adoption at 19. She was in law school, didn't want the distraction. She buried the story so deep, not even her closest associates know. We've confirmed everything. Records, names, the works." I closed my eyes. The image of Vanessa's smug face, her legs crossed in my chair, flashed across my mind. A woman so consumed by ambition, she erased the most fundamental bond any mother knows. It was the hypocrisy that struck me hardest. This was the same woman who dared to paint me as unstable, manipulative, a mother using her child like a bargaining chip, when she had abandoned her own without a second glance. "We're not leaking this to the tabloids," I said quietly, already knowing the answer in my bones. "Not to some sleazy gossip rag." "No," Mark agreed. "We're sending it to the New York Times as an in-depth investigative piece. Thoughtful, respectable, let the story speak for itself." I didn't respond immediately. I looked out the window at the soft light falling over the street. Somewhere in the distance, wind rustled through trees, the world spinning on as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just burned my life down and started over. "Do it," I said finally. And just like that, the first real crack in Vanessa Marlowe's armor was set to split wide open. While Mark prepared the legal strike, I poured myself into something else, something that had once made me feel powerful and seen. Art. I called Celia. "Ready to stop hiding?" she asked. "Not just ready," I replied. "I need to create again. I need to build something that's mine." She didn't ask questions. She just opened her doors. I started spending my afternoons at the gallery, helping curate a new exhibit. I wasn't just healing, I was growing sharp again. The pain and rage began to crystallize into clarity. My eye returned, my taste, my instincts. I was no longer a wife trying to salvage her life. I was a woman redefining it. Meanwhile, Graham was unraveling. His texts turned from apologies to pleading, then from pleading to rage, then back again. "Talk to me," he wrote. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I made a mistake, but we can fix it. Julia, please." But silence is louder than any scream, and I kept mine wrapped tight around me like armor. Then came the second explosion. The New York Times article landed like a thunderclap. It didn't just expose Vanessa's past, it held a mirror up to her soul. A woman who clawed her way to the top, sacrificing everything human along the way, now revealed as a mother who had once cast her child aside for the promise of power. The piece was clinical, heartbreaking, and utterly damning. The fallout was immediate. Vanessa was terminated by Blake Properties within 24 hours. Not even Graham could stop it. The board saw her for what she truly was, not just a liability, but a threat to their image, their stability, their profits. The woman who thought she could play dirty and win found herself exiled in silence. And Graham? He went quiet too. Mark called me that evening, the glee in his voice carefully restrained. "That was your first checkmate," he said, "and we haven't even started the divorce proceedings." I exhaled deeply, one hand tracing slow circles over my belly. I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. It was almost comical, how fast the tide turned after Vanessa's secret hit the news. One moment she was the ice queen of high finance, The next, she was radio silence, a ghost in stilettos. According to Mark, she showed up to the office the next day with her chin held high and a designer coat draped over her shoulders like armor. But no one met her eyes. The whispers trailed behind her like smoke. The board didn't even pretend to deliberate. They cut her loose, cold, and clean. But I wasn't celebrating, not really. It wasn't joy I felt, not victory. It was something quieter, steadier, like standing on scorched earth and realizing you're still alive. Graham didn't call after the article dropped. Not immediately. I think for the first time he realized this wasn't a tantrum. I wasn't threatening to leave, I had. I'd vanished from his life with surgical precision, and the woman he thought he could pivot to as a safety net had just been incinerated in front of the entire city. But he didn't stay silent for long. 3 days later, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I stared at it for a moment, then answered. Julia? His voice. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I heard it. It wasn't confident anymore. It wasn't charming. It was low, hesitant, like he was afraid I might hang up. What are you doing? He asked. The injunction? You're freezing my assets? You're going to destroy everything we built. I closed my eyes. We didn't build anything, Graham. I decorated the facade while you poured gasoline behind the walls. Damn it, Julia. No, I said, and my voice didn't shake. You don't get to be angry. You don't get to raise your voice. You forfeited that when you put your head in another woman's lap in my chair. He went quiet. The kind of quiet where you know a man is staring into the abyss and realizing it's staring back. That injunction, I continued, is to protect my son. You know, the one you used to talk to every night? The one you promised would inherit the world? Well, the world's on fire now, and I'm making sure there's something left for him to hold. You're trying to ruin me. No, I said, cold and calm. You ruined yourself. I'm just making sure I'm not standing under the wreckage when it collapses. I hung up. It wasn't rage that filled me afterward. It was peace. The next few days were a blur of signatures, paperwork, strategy meetings. Mark and his team moved like a war machine. They filed the divorce on grounds of adultery, moral breach, and emotional distress. The prenup had a clause, a morality clause, that Graham had violated in the most public, undeniable way. But that wasn't the masterstroke. That came with the injunction. Mark had timed it perfectly. The morning the financial courts processed the freeze on a sizable portion of Graham's personal assets and, more importantly, his shares in Blake Properties, the boardroom at the top of that sleek glass tower erupted into chaos. His control over the company had always been tight-fisted, but now it was weakened, precarious, and in high-stakes real estate, weakness doesn't go unnoticed. Vanessa thought she'd lit the match by leaking the affair to the press, but I was the one holding the gasoline, and now the fire was roaring through their ivory tower. Mark called it the Queen's Gambit. You're not just divorcing him, he said. You're launching a hostile takeover. At night, I lay in bed in my quiet apartment, the hum of the city softened by thick windows and soft linens. My baby kicked often now, strong and steady. I would rub my belly and whisper, "We're okay, I promise, we're going to be okay." It was the first time in weeks I believed myself, but Graham wasn't done. Not yet. One morning I received an alert from a friend at a law firm downtown. "Check the Diaz report," the text read. My hands went cold. Marco Diaz, gossip peddler, professional snake. His headlines were poison disguised as pulp. The article was brutal. A character assassination disguised as a profile piece. It painted me as unstable, manipulative. Said I had trapped Graham with a pregnancy. That I faked emotional distress to squeeze money out of a poor, overworked CEO. It was filled with anonymous sources, a few strategically selected photos from years ago where I looked tired, strained, mid-argument, completely stripped of context. I felt sick. I slammed my laptop shut, heart pounding. She was behind it. Vanessa. Even out of power, she was still striking. A snake with 1,000 lives. I called Mark. "This is war," I said. "No," he corrected. "That was war. This is scorched earth." He was already moving, already pulling strings. He knew Diaz's sources were smoke and mirrors, but the public didn't need facts to believe what it wanted. People didn't see truth. They saw drama. The story was everywhere by noon. I became the villain, the social climber, the woman who cried betrayal with a baby bump and a lawsuit. For the first time since I walked out of that office, I broke. I curled up on the floor of my bathroom, cheek against the cool tile, the echo of lies ringing in my ears. All the strength I had built felt like it had turned to dust. I was a punchline in a city I once loved. I didn't cry like before. It was quieter now, a kind of broken that didn't come with sobs, just silence, just stillness. When I finally spoke, it was to Mark. My voice was almost a whisper. I don't know if I can do this. There was a pause on the line. Then his voice, steady, unfaltering. You can, and you will. You're not drowning, Mrs. Blake, you're swimming, and I'm the shark swimming beside you. That night, I stood in front of the mirror. My skin was pale, my eyes hollow, but when I looked down at my belly, when I saw the small flutter beneath the fabric of my dress, I remembered. This wasn't just about me. This was about my son. Vanessa had tried to destroy me with words, with innuendo, with spin, but the truth was still on my side. The truth had a heartbeat. The truth had my eyes and Graham's chin and a future that no headline could erase. Mark and I regrouped the next day. There was one card left to play. We didn't want to use it, but if Vanessa wanted to drag me through the mud, she'd better be prepared to get dirty. We dug deeper, harder, and what we found made the last scandal look like child's play. Her real secret wasn't just the daughter. It was the deal she'd cut to keep it hidden, a financial cover-up, a name scrubbed from records, and someone, somewhere, had the paperwork. The next move was mine. And this time, I wasn't going to hesitate. The world thought they were watching a woman unravel. What they didn't realize was I was reassembling. Stronger, sharper, and far more dangerous. The next morning, the sun poured through the windows of my apartment like it didn't know the world had tried to rip me apart the night before. I sat at the kitchen table, hands curled around a chipped ceramic mug, the scent of chamomile rising like a lullaby I was too tired to hear. I hadn't slept. My phone screen lay face down on the table, silent but heavy with expectation. I didn't need it to buzz. I knew what was coming. Mark arrived just after 9. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He took one look at me, barefoot, in Graham's old sweatshirt, hair tied up with no care left to give, and slid a folder across the table like he was laying a weapon at my feet. "We found the trail," he said. I looked at the manila folder like it might bite. The adoption? No, something worse. That got my attention. "Vanessa didn't just give up her daughter," he said, voice low. "She paid to have her erased." My hands froze on the mug. Erased? Legally, technically, and financially. She didn't want anyone to know, so she used an offshore account to pay a third-party facilitator to ensure the records were sealed beyond public access. But the facilitator got sloppy. He skimmed a little, left a trail in Switzerland. We traced the payment. I stared at him, my stomach a cold knot of disbelief. She bought her way out of motherhood. Mark nodded grimly. "And we have proof." I didn't touch the folder. There it was, what we had been looking for, the final nail in Vanessa's immaculate coffin. And still, it felt wrong, like stepping on someone else's bones to get free. "She has a child out there," I murmured, "someone she chose to forget." "She has a pattern," Mark corrected, "erasing what she doesn't want. First a child, then you. If we let this go, she'll rewrite everything and come back stronger." I closed my eyes, exhaled, and touched my belly out of habit. Ethan kicked. A small, solid thump. The kind that reminded me he was real, he was here, and I was his only line of defense. "She tried to make me look like I didn't matter," I said quietly. "She turned my baby into a bargaining chip, my reputation into trash. She wanted the world to see me as fragile, hysterical, unfit." "Then show them who you really are," Mark said. "Use this. Not out of spite, out of strategy." It didn't take long. We handed the story to a journalist we trusted, not a gossip columnist, but a serious reporter from the New York Times, someone with credibility, compassion, and teeth. The article wouldn't be a tabloid bomb. It would be a clinical autopsy of Vanessa Marlowe's past, written in clean, surgical prose. It would outline her ambition, her decisions, the payment trail, and the lies that followed. It would ask questions she'd never wanted answered. By the end of the week, the piece was live. The backlash was swift and thunderous. Vanessa, once hailed as the rising star of the city's real estate elite, was suddenly the subject of op-eds and think pieces, titled things like, "Can Women Have It All If They Abandon It First?" and "Power Without Conscience, the Vanessa Marlowe Problem." Her former supporters turned quiet. Blake Properties board members released a collective statement reaffirming the company's commitment to integrity and transparency. And Vanessa? She vanished. No comments, no rebuttals. Just silence, deep, echoing silence. She didn't walk into meetings anymore like she owned the place. She didn't smile smugly from behind tinted car windows. She didn't appear on magazine covers. She simply evaporated, the way the powerful do when they know they've been cornered and there's no exit that won't cost them their soul. Graham didn't call. I wondered if he was watching the fallout from some penthouse suite or maybe from the Hamptons estate he'd once promised would be our family's summer home. I didn't care, not anymore, because something had shifted. For the first time since I walked out of his office, I wasn't reacting. I was directing. I wasn't surviving. I was building. Every day I returned to the gallery with Celia. We planned a new exhibition, one showcasing young artists who'd been ignored by the city's elite. I curated pieces with bruised edges and raw truth, art that had something to say. I poured myself into the work like it was oxygen. Every choice I made, every frame, every brushstroke, every spotlight, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Meanwhile, Mark was coordinating the next step, presenting a full case for divorce, complete with asset division, custody arrangements, and long-term shares in Blake Properties held in a trust for Ethan. Graham's legal team will try to negotiate, Mark said. They'll want to avoid court. Let them try, I said. But we're not giving an inch. He smiled. They're terrified of you, you know. They should be. The old me, the one who planned anniversary surprises and thought love was a steady flame that couldn't be doused, was gone. In her place was someone steel-spined and clear-eyed, someone who understood leverage, someone who didn't need her husband's last name to carry weight in a boardroom. The next week, I received a package at my door. No return address. Inside was a single object, a silver photo frame. The picture inside was of me and Graham, smiling on the balcony of our penthouse, the city stretching wide behind us like a promise. I was wearing the red dress he loved. He was holding a glass of champagne. Our eyes were locked. Behind the photo, a note, in his handwriting. I still see you, I'm sorry. Gee, I stared at it for a long time. Then I placed the frame in the trash, closed the lid, and opened the window to let in the clean autumn air. The world had seen Vanessa fall. Now it was time for them to see what a woman like me, written off, underestimated, discarded, could rise to become. Because I wasn't the scandal. I wasn't the collapse. I was the reconstruction. And Ethan would be born into a world where his mother didn't just survive betrayal, she turned it into legacy. The news hit Graham like a missile, swift, targeted, and impossible to ignore. The moment the Times article exposed Vanessa's carefully hidden truth, he became collateral damage in the fallout. I didn't need a press release to tell me. I could feel it in the silence. He didn't respond publicly. No statements, no denials. And for a man who had once thrived on controlling the narrative, on orchestrating headlines and manipulating perception, his silence was the loudest confession of all. But then, out of nowhere, Graham resurfaced. He didn't return to the boardroom or the penthouse or the social circuits where his name still caused a ripple. No, he went where no one had seen him in years, the Hamptons, the Thornfield estate. A sprawling cedar-shingled mansion built by his father, now long gone and mostly abandoned. It was a place of summer parties, glittering fundraisers, and memories sealed in crystal glasses, until now. Mark called me 2 days after the article dropped. He's disappeared, he said. I raised an eyebrow. He's a billionaire. They don't disappear, they retreat. Well, Mark said dryly, he's retreating hard. Took a car out to the estate, no staff, no assistants, just him. And maybe guilt, maybe ghosts. I imagined him alone in those echoing halls, walking past oil portraits of a family name now dented, passing the study where his father had once lectured him about honor and legacy. Maybe he'd finally realized the weight of what he'd done. That it wasn't just me he'd betrayed. It was the version of himself he used to believe in. But remorse doesn't rebuild what you burned. Back in Manhattan, the real storm was still unfolding. With Vanessa gone and Graham self-exiled, Blake Properties had become a ship without a captain. The boardroom turned into a battlefield, silent power struggles, whispered alliances, and corporate sharks circling in custom-tailored suits. The emergency board meeting was scheduled. Mark knew the moment the company became unstable, I had leverage. He leaned across the desk and said it with a gleam in his eye. It's time. I knew what he meant. I wasn't just the wife anymore. I was the majority stakeholder's gatekeeper, the mother of the heir. I had frozen enough of Graham's shares that no major decision could be made without me. But when Mark suggested I attend the board meeting myself, I balked. I'm not a CEO, I said. I'm an art curator. He tilted his head. No, you're a woman who's outmaneuvered a billionaire, publicly dismantled a corporate predator, and turned public perception on its head, all while growing a child. They think they'll be dealing with a broken housewife. What they'll get is the woman who just destroyed two of the most powerful figures in their company. Still, the thought of walking into that room, the stares, the judgment, the unspoken sexism, made my stomach turn. I confessed it to Celia late one night, my fingers curled around a cup of ginger tea. They'll eat me alive. They won't, she said firmly, because you won't go in there as Julia Blake, the wife. You'll go in as Julia Blake, the mother of this company's future. That's your armor, that's your fire. She helped me prepare. Mark briefed me on the financials, the upcoming projects, the board's weakest links. I studied until my eyes ached. It wasn't about money, it was about meaning. And when I understood what Blake Properties could be, what it was supposed to be, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Purpose. On the day of the meeting, I didn't dress to disappear. I wore a navy blue wrap dress that framed my belly with intention, not shame. A single strand of pearls, my grandmother's. No makeup beyond a touch of color on my lips and a quiet fire in my eyes. Mark and Celia flanked me as we stepped into the glass and mahogany tower, like it was our stage. The boardroom on the 50th floor smelled like polished wood and power. 12 men in tailored suits sat around the long table, and every single one of them looked up when I walked in. Some were skeptical, some were amused. One or two were openly dismissive. Let them underestimate me. I sat at the head of the table, Graham's seat, and let the silence stretch just long enough to shift the room's gravity. Then I spoke. I didn't talk about the affair. Not once. I didn't mention betrayal, scandal, or shame. I talked about legacy. For 50 years, I began, Blake Properties has stood as a symbol of New York's ambition. But recently that symbol has cracked. Not because of market forces, not because of outside competition, but because of internal rot. I laid out my proposal, a pivot towards sustainable architecture, partnerships with local communities, ethical labor, transparency. I presented projections, numbers, a 5-year plan designed not to salvage the company, but to renew it. I had done my homework, and I didn't flinch. At some point, one of the board members, a round-faced man named Lawrence, cut in with a sneer. This is all very idealistic, Mrs. Blake, but this is the real world. What exactly do you want? I met his gaze without blinking. What I want, I said slowly, is the future. I stood, my presence filling the room like thunder without sound. The shares currently frozen under the injunction represent a significant stake in this company. They belong, by legal and moral right, to my son, Ethan Blake. He will one day inherit that legacy. I am here not to destroy Blake Properties, but to ensure that when he is old enough to walk through these halls, he finds them worth inheriting. Silence. Then I delivered the finishing blow. I do not wish to be CEO, I said. But I will be taking a permanent seat on this board, and I have a recommendation for interim CEO, a man of integrity, experience, and vision. I nodded toward Daniel Chen, a younger executive whose reputation was spotless and whose quiet leadership had gone unnoticed until now. The board voted, unanimous. As we exited the room, the skyline of Manhattan stretched behind us like a conquered city. I didn't smile, I didn't cry, I just breathed. That night, Graham finally called, not to yell, not to beg, to say only this: you saved it. And I did. I had walked into the lion's den, 8 months pregnant and wearing a strand of pearls, and emerged holding the future in the palm of my hand. Not as a wife, not as a victim, as something else entirely, a force. The news of my rise to the board spread faster than I could have imagined. Within hours, financial blogs buzzed with surprise, social media whispered with speculation, and headlines began to shift their tone. The woman who took back the tower. One article read, not the jilted wife, not the pregnant victim. I was now the strategist, the reformer, even the unexpected power behind the curtain. But I didn't care about the names. Not really. What mattered was that my son's future was no longer dangling from the edge of Graham's crumbling empire. I had given it a spine, a structure, something unshakable. The foundation was mine now, and I would see it through. For weeks, I worked quietly but relentlessly from the inside. I reviewed contracts, I rewrote policies, I vetted ethical sourcing plans and approved community housing projects in neighborhoods Graham had once dismissed as low yield. I sat in the same meetings Vanessa used to dominate, and I made sure the people across from me understood. This company would never again belong to snakes in heels and suits with secrets. And Graham? He stayed gone. The estate in the Hamptons swallowed him whole. According to Mark's sources, he hadn't returned to Manhattan once. No boardrooms, no parties, no press, just silence. Occasionally I'd hear that he'd taken up long walks on the beach or spent afternoons sitting alone in his father's old study, surrounded by dust-covered books on legacy and leadership. He had become a ghost with a surname. But even ghosts leave shadows. One evening, I was leaving the gallery after a long day of curating the upcoming exhibit with Celia when I got the message. It was from Arthur, one of the junior board members. "He's back in the city. I thought you'd want to know." I didn't answer. I just stood there for a moment, staring out at the lights of Manhattan blinking like a million eyes. I knew what was coming. The city had been waiting, and so had he. 2 days later, Graham called a press conference. It was held at Blake Tower in the main atrium, the same space where we'd once toasted to breaking ground on a midtown project, where he'd once lifted me up in his arms after cutting the ribbon. Now it was filled with journalists and cameras, buzzing like locusts. I didn't attend. I watched it from my apartment, barefoot, with Ethan rolling softly inside me. The screen flickered to life, and there he was, Graham Blake, thinner, paler, a man clearly hollowed out by something more than time. He stood behind the podium with no script, no teleprompter. Just a folded sheet of paper in his hands he never even looked at. "My name is Graham Blake," he began, "and I am the man who burned down his own kingdom." There were murmurs, shifting cameras, sudden silence. "I'm not here to defend what I did," he continued, voice low, steady, stripped of its old confidence. "There is no defense. I betrayed my wife, I betrayed my company, and worst of all, I betrayed the values I was raised on, the ones I swore I would honor." He paused. "Vanessa Marlowe is gone, and rightly so. But let's be clear. I brought her in. I gave her the power. I made the choices. I turned my back on the woman who built the heart of my home while I chased the illusion of something shinier." I watched stone-faced as he spoke. It was surreal, like watching a statue crack open and reveal flesh. "I'm stepping down from all executive duties indefinitely," he said. "Not just for the company, but to fix what I've broken. To be better. To be the kind of man my son can someday be proud of." He stepped away from the podium then, and the room erupted in flashes and shouts. But I turned off the screen. Because what mattered wasn't his public confession. It was the private truth I now held. I didn't need his redemption. I didn't need his performance. I had already built my own peace without his help. But still, something stirred inside me. Some ember of the man I once loved, flickering faintly in the wreckage. He wasn't the same man who had fallen to his knees in front of Vanessa. He was quieter now, smaller, and perhaps, finally, human. A week later, I gave birth. It was early autumn when Ethan Blake entered the world. The leaves had just begun to turn, and the city outside the hospital window was a blur of red and gold. It wasn't a dramatic labor, no ambulances, no chaos, just a quiet, steady unfolding of life. I held him in my arms for the first time under the soft light of a bedside lamp, and everything else, the war, the headlines, the heartbreak, fell away. He was perfect. 10 tiny fingers. Eyes still uncertain but somehow already familiar. A full head of dark hair, and a grip so strong it made me laugh through my tears. I didn't expect Graham to come. But he did. He didn't knock. He stood in the doorway like a man visiting a church he wasn't sure would still welcome him. He looked exhausted. There were lines on his face I hadn't seen before. His suit was rumpled, his posture unsure. His eyes met mine with a quiet that said everything. I didn't speak. I didn't move. "He's beautiful," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Yes," I said softly, not looking away from Ethan. "He is." He didn't ask to hold him. I didn't offer. There was a space between us, wide and deep and filled with the ruins of everything we used to be, but there was no hatred left in me. No more fire, just the weight of time and the clarity that comes when you've already survived the worst. He stayed for 5 minutes, maybe 10. Then he left. No promises, no apologies. Just a man who had seen the life he helped create and knew, finally, what it cost to almost lose it. Later that night, I held Ethan close to my chest and whispered, "We're not going back. Not ever. But I hope your father finds his way forward." Because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is walk away even after the sorries come. The next morning I filed the final papers. The divorce would be clean, civil, but make no mistake, it would be mine. Because I wasn't the broken woman in the chair anymore. I was the one who stood up. The days after Ethan's birth passed in a kind of golden haze, quiet, sacred, suspended. Our hospital room overlooked the city skyline, but all I saw was him. He slept curled against my chest like he belonged nowhere else. His breath was soft, steady, and so real, it made every betrayal behind me feel like a bad dream I'd finally awakened from. I didn't check the news. I didn't answer emails. For the first time in months, I allowed myself stillness. The nurses came and went. The room smelled like linen and antiseptic, but to me it felt like sanctuary. I fed him, hummed lullabies I barely remembered from childhood, and wrote his name over and over again in the journal beside my bed. Ethan Graham Blake. Graham sent flowers, a tasteful arrangement, white orchids and soft green hydrangeas. No card, just a note from the nurse, from Mr. Blake. I left them in the hallway. 2 days later, I was discharged. Celia met me at the hospital doors with a car seat already buckled in place, a thermos of ginger tea in her hand, and a soft smile on her lips. "Ready to go home?" she asked. I looked down at my son, who blinked sleepily in his blanket. "We already are." My apartment, modest, warm, and mine, welcomed us like a familiar hug. The nursery had been prepared weeks ago, thanks to Celia's relentless organization and the sudden nesting instincts that had overtaken me late in the pregnancy. There was a soft rug, a rocking chair by the window, and a crib lined with fabric printed with stars and hot air balloons, an echo of the one Graham had once sketched for the penthouse. But this time, the fantasy belonged to me. The dreams were mine. Ethan fit into the space perfectly. Nights blurred into days. Feedings, lullabies, tiny coos. I was exhausted, yes, but not broken. There was something grounding in caring for someone who needed you completely. It reminded me of my own strength, of how far I had come, and with every sigh that escaped his lips, I let go of one more thread of the life I'd left behind. Still, outside my little sanctuary, the world hadn't stopped spinning. Graham's press conference had triggered a shift in the company, and Blake Properties was scrambling to stabilize. Daniel Chen, the new interim CEO I had backed, was holding steady. He'd already implemented several of the ethics policies I had proposed, and our stock had begun to climb again, slowly but surely. Investors, once wary, were starting to lean in again. Mark called me often now, not as a lawyer, but as an advisor. "They want you back in the boardroom," he told me one afternoon, while I cradled Ethan in one arm and balanced a bottle in the other. "Give it time," I said. "They've spent decades ignoring women like me. A few more months won't kill them." But what I didn't say was that I needed the time too, not to recover but to choose. Power had never been the goal. Safety was. Legacy, my son. And now that I had those in hand, I wasn't sure how much of the old world I even wanted to return to. One morning, just as the leaves outside turned brittle gold, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a couriered document. A handwritten letter. Thick paper, familiar script. "Julia, you don't owe me anything, but I owe you everything. You were right, about all of it. And I'm sorry, not just for what I did, but for how long I made you believe you were the one breaking. I see now it was me all along. I don't know who I am anymore. But I know who you are. You are the strongest person I have ever known. And Ethan? He's lucky. He has you. I don't expect forgiveness, but if there's ever a day when you can look at me without hate, I hope I'm still standing." I read it once, then again, and then I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Not because I forgave him, not yet, maybe not ever, but because it mattered to see him finally look in the mirror. Weeks passed, the city moved on. Gossip columns turned their attention to newer scandals. But quietly, consistently, my story endured. I didn't grant interviews. I didn't write a memoir. I simply did the work. At the gallery, our exhibition launched, featuring young, overlooked artists from Harlem, the Bronx, Queens. It wasn't flashy, but it was real, and it was packed every night. I watched from the back with Ethan in a sling against my chest, swaying gently as voices filled the space with awe and appreciation. One evening, Daniel Chen showed up. He approached me cautiously, holding a glass of water like it was a peace offering. "We're starting to build the housing project in East Brooklyn," he said. "We used your design guidelines, sustainable materials, local labor." I nodded, smiling. "That's good." He hesitated. "You could come back, officially. Take your seat again. The board listens to you. Investors trust you." "I'm listening," I said, rocking Ethan gently. He looked at the baby, then at me. "When you're ready." That night, after I tucked Ethan into his crib, I stood by the window, watching the city shimmer with life. My phone buzzed with another update, another board decision that aligned with the reforms I had set in motion. Even from a distance, I was shaping the future. But not for Graham. Not for redemption. For Ethan. Because someday, he'd grow up and ask about his name, about the man who left and the woman who stayed, about the company his parents once fought over like two kings in a chess game. And I would tell him the truth, that love can shatter. That power can be taken or given, but strength, the real kind, is built in the ruins. I'd tell him that his mother sat at a table full of men and never flinched, that she was called a victim and proved them wrong, that she was betrayed, broken, ridiculed, and then she rose. Not as a queen in a tower, but as a woman with a baby on her hip and steel in her spine. And I would tell him that he was the reason I survived it all. Because when the world tried to take everything from me, I held on to him, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means something in Julia's journey resonated with you. Her strength, her heartbreak, or maybe her quiet decision to rebuild, not for revenge but for her child, her peace, and her future. This story reminds us that betrayal doesn't define us, how we rise after it does. Sometimes, the greatest strength is not in fighting back, but in walking away with dignity, rebuilding brick by brick, and choosing legacy over pain. Julia didn't just survive, she transformed, and in doing so, she rewrote the rules of power, motherhood, and self-worth. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of Julia's story moved you the most? Drop a comment below. I read every one. And if you want more stories like this, stories of resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Turn on the bell and never miss a moment that could change the way you see love, loss, and life. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never forget, you are worth more than the pain you've endured.